Greetings, and welcome to the first session of Communication Studies 495, Media and Society. As you can see on the screen in front of you, my name's Will Heath. I am the instructor of record for this spring. I will confess up front, this is a new experience for me. This class is all online, so I will be talking to you through your devices throughout the semester. It will be an interesting experience for all of us, hopefully. The best way for us to reach out to one another will be through email. You see my email there on the screen. I am also on social media. There's my Twitter handle. I am available to meet with you in person at any point. My office hours are not set because I don't really have an office to speak of. I am available most of the time during the week and can arrange meetings for you either in the office. I can meet you for coffee. I can do whatever it is that makes you the most comfortable. And we can also Skype. This is certainly going to be something where I would like to meet you, as many of you as I can. This is where you can follow me on Twitter. I typically tweet things related to the course throughout the semester. While the course hashtag is in the syllabus. The syllabus, of course, is available through Canvas, which is where all of our course material is going to be available. Let me lead you on to the 3 rules. I have these for class, but I also have these sort of for real life. The first one is be present. Presence, obviously, in an online class is a little bit of an interesting dynamic. I can't see you, and it's difficult for me to know how engaged you are in anything. Pretty much all of the course material that you're going to need to do well in this class will be available through these lectures. So it is important that number 1, you download the lectures or pull them up. Number 2, that you pay attention to them. That seems fairly obvious, but I can tell you even in classes where the instructor is present in the room, it's not always something that people abide by. The human attention span typically spans something around 15 minutes. So it's a good idea, I think, to take advantage of the medium that we've been given here and pause it periodically. Make sure you're absorbing everything we're going throughout the semester. And if you have questions, certainly reach out. That leads me to number 2, be prepared. I will be posting readings from the textbook, from other sources throughout the class. I will post those to Canvas so that you can read those. Definitely read through those texts. If you have any questions, reach out to me as quickly as possible. Also, pay attention to the news. Obviously, lots of news happening during this particular semester. It will be important for you to pay attention to news specifically related to mass media. This will become important later on in the semester. The third thing, and probably the most important thing, as important as the first 2, is to be honest. If you are struggling, if something doesn't make sense, if certain things feel like they should be one way or the other, if you have a problem with grading or with anything that happens in the class, I would like to know about it. We'll be communicating pretty regularly starting today and throughout the semester. I want your participation, and I want you to be honest with me about what's working and what isn't. This is a first-time thing for me at UAB, and it's a first-time thing for me in the all-online setting. And I'm going to do my best to meet your needs to help you be successful, whatever your definition of success is. I am a former journalist. That's the vantage point that I'm going to come at this particular topic on. I spent roughly a decade working in newspapers, small community newspapers. I've seen what journalism looks like in small towns and in small communities. I did defend my dissertation in June and graduated in August with a PhD in mass communication, specifically focusing on what you might call media sociology. So my understanding of how media and society interact comes through the lens of certain sociological concepts that we'll get into later in the semester. I do have a love for print journalism, and I will go back to it a couple times during the semester. As you'll find, print journalism is not so much dying as it is shifting. People pretty much, if they're learning how to be journalists, are having to learn how to operate on multiple different platforms. And that includes those of us who are having to teach journalism and mass communication at the outset. If you go through the syllabus, you'll see that we'll do 2 exams, midterm and a final. We'll do online discussion throughout the semester. And I want everybody to lead some discussion. I want everybody to participate in discussion. And then, obviously, I want to work on research. It's a 400 level class. You should know how to, or at least be getting around to, what it looks like to work in research, specifically as it relates to mass media. That includes an annotated bibliography and a research paper. So, our goal throughout this semester is what's called media literacy. Presumably, if you've made it this far in your academic career, you understand the concept of how media work and what impact they have on your life specifically. We're going to engage that in a little bit more detail. So, let's start here with some course objectives. One of our course objectives is to jumbo linear transmissions for our proto-expletive recombinations. Who wrote that? Later, there's burrito and Goldfinger and Egg McMuffin lumberjacks aplenty. And finally, we'll be preternaturally crumulent as we rotate our grommets. That is nonsense, is it not? Of course it is. You don't know what I'm saying. I said words, you heard words, they're in the right language, but we didn't communicate. And I did all that for a specific reason. In order to think about mass communication, we have to think about what communication is. We have to define the terms. Defining communication, I use this one. It comes from a scholar named James Carey, and it's the process of creating shared meaning. This is the definition that I'm going to use for communication throughout the class. It's a cultural definition of communication. Basically, we say we create and we refine our reality through the way we communicate. This definition tells us 3 things. First of all, process. Communication is a process. It doesn't just automatically happen. We're going to talk about some models later on today that sort of define how that process happens. The next important word in that sentence is creating. Communication involves creation. The question is a creation process, right? If you're a PR practitioner or a reporter or an advertising executive, you spend hours crafting a message. Sometimes a message can be created accidentally, which is it's not a deliberate act. In other words, other people interpret different meanings based on what you say. But the result is what's called shared meaning or shared reality. Communication is the foundation of our culture. So think about this class. So there are, according to my notes, 30 people, give or take, enrolled in this class. We come from diverse backgrounds. We come from all different types of religions, different types of cultures, different regions of the country, speak different languages. The thing we have in common is the communication we share. The communication brings us together. What you said or didn't say to people before this class started and what you say once we get started, all of that communication creates the reality of the class that you're experiencing. Communication creates meaning, and therefore that's what gives us the culture that we live in. Your reality is different from my reality, and your reality may be different from the reality of another person who's sitting through this class. We continue our communication until we agree upon a mutually shared meaning. It's very important in our class material, by the way. If I therefore define communication as the process of creating shared meaning, and you define it on a test as the process of creating a grilled cheese sandwich, we are going to have to come to some sort of an agreement on which one of those is actually reality. My reality is going to be the one that holds sway, but that's one of the advantages of being on this end of the camera. Society is no different. Advertisers are spending millions of dollars to tell you that short pants are okay to wear. You've seen ads, regardless of the fact that you might have ugly legs. Our culture has taught us that it's okay to wear shorts. I actually saw an article today that I meant to bring in with me from The Atlantic that talks about people who wear shorts all during the winter as some sort of a cultural statement. And by the way, those ads have even told you what type of shorts to wear. Capris or culottes or cutoffs or baggies, and they change the style so they can sell you something new. Clothing is cultural communication and a way to make money by changing styles. Now, communication unites and divides us. That's the next important thing that we need to understand about the way we communicate. I want to apologize in advance for the spot. I graduated from the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa 2 different times, so this particular video resonated with me based on the culture that I grew up in.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide, y'all. Roll Tide, Margaret.
Roll Tide. Roll Tide.
Get sauce. Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
It's such an honor. Roll Tide.
Roll Tide?
Yep.
Y'all don't even know he was a virgin until he's 28, and now, Roll Tide. Woo!
Hi, Mary and Daisy. Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
He will always be remembered. Roll Tide.
Based on that video, what would you say Roll Tide actually means in this culture? The reality is, it can mean whatever we want it to mean. It means hello, it means goodbye, it means we made a deal, it means please, thank you, I enjoyed that, farewell, shows pride, it shows humility. It is a phrase that brings people together. You can be in other states and other nations and seeing people from like backgrounds, and Roll Tide brings them together as an instant understanding and acceptance of one another. Now, having said that, that type of communication is also meant to divide. If you like this logo better, we also have this particular video for you.
There are 2 words that give you a sense of belonging, even when you're far from home. And when you hear them, you know you're with family.
War Eagle.
2 simple words.
War Eagle.
Uniquely Auburn. War Eagle.
Depending on what side of this particular rivalry you're on, these 2 videos made you feel a certain way. That's okay. The point is that communication is meant to bring one community together, but it's also meant to communicate to other communities that that's really not for them. That video keeps, that type of communication, rather, keeps people out. It unites one type of people, and it divides others. Based on the shared meaning we create through our communication. That's how we create our community, and it's how we create our society. If you're not a sports fan, this can still resonate with you in different types of ways. Maybe it makes you think of a fraternity or a sorority or a religious group that you're in or a political party. Any type of group that you're in, talking about your high school friends or maybe your childhood friends or long lost cousins. There are certain stories, there are certain types of communication that bring you together, but also sort of keep out the people who are around you. Now, we're talking about 4 different types of communication, how they're different. Most of this, I assume, is review for you guys. But I want to go over it real quick to make sure we've established a foundation. We're going to start with intrapersonal. Intrapersonal communication is essentially you talking to yourself, your internal monologue, the things you say when you're at a party, when you're driving in your car, that only you can hear. The things that you say while you're listening to a lecture. Is he ever going to shut up? He can't shut up. I may die in here. Did I eat Wendy's twice yesterday? Those are the sort of things that we'd call intrapersonal communication. After that, we have interpersonal, which is you talking with another person. Interpersonal is a fascinating field of communication. There are some very good people on this campus who teach interpersonal communication. I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, obviously, because we're talking about mass media, but it is a very interesting field and something that is probably worth your study. Real interpersonal communication obviously is a give and take process. People respond to one another. If your message is not understood, you find another way to get that message across. If you're really communicating, you have to understand the messages that the other person is intending to communicate. And you come together to create a shared meaning of reality. Like I said before, interpersonal communication, you can learn a lot more about it from some people in our building who are a lot smarter than I am, or rather have done more study on it than I have. I will tell you, most people are interested in relationship counseling and interpersonal communication, which is not something that I'm particularly good at, as my wife will be more than happy to tell you. After that, you have what's called group communication, which is your typical classroom setting or any type of a speech. So there are more than two people who are receiving the message, and there's usually one or only a handful of senders. The dynamics change at this point because now you're having to account for all the other people. There's more work to take turns, more worry about appearing foolish in front of multiple people, but there's also more control. Someone tends to dominate a group during group communication. Sometimes you appoint a leader, which is a teacher or a boss or an expert to guide the communication. Other times it's a free-for-all. The bottom line is there's less intimacy in that particular setting. And then finally, you come to the highest level of communication, which is what's called mass communication, which is obviously why we're all here. Mass communication is defined as using a mass medium to send a message to a large audience for the purpose of informing, entertaining, or persuading. We're going to come back to those three things here in just a moment. Here's a model of these four types of communication. What I want to point out in this model is the further up you go, the fewer senders you have and the more receivers. So there are only a handful of people who are engaging in mass communication. A lot of people are consuming it. Mass communication serves three purposes in society, starting with informing. Mass communication can tell you what's going on. Yesterday, I was in Trustful eating ice cream with my kids. There was a very loud boom that shook the windows and rattled the floor. Nobody quite knew what it was. Immediately, you go to your mass media to ask them what happened. That's the basic task of mass communication. After that is entertaining, to keep you happy or at least not bored. And then the last thing is persuasion, which is to sell you stuff. Sell you stuff and sell you ideas. As you can see, these things are not mutually exclusive. It's nearly always useful to entertain as you persuade, and it's sometimes useful to entertain even as you inform. Think about this class. Hopefully, you learn some things while also getting some sort of entertainment value out of it. The problem, as you have no doubt figured out, very frequently entertainment gets in the way of informing. Sometimes we're so busy trying to keep your attention that we forget to actually inform you properly, or we have to dumb down information to keep you entertained. Think about television news. Did you learn anything? Or is it just there to keep you distracted? What makes mass communication different from other types? We've already talked about there are the fewest number of senders and the largest number of receivers. Mass communication requires a channel. For the record, Channel doesn't necessarily, you probably think of broadcasting television specifically when you hear the word channel. Mass communication requires a tool. It just means a device. That can be a newspaper, that can be TV, radio, your phone, billboard, film screen to deliver that message. Therefore, that makes mass communication a mediated form of communication. There is something between you and whoever is receiving the message that you're trying to send out. Think about the way that we're broadcasting this lecture today. There is a lot of equipment physically between me and whoever is actually receiving the communication. In fact, that word media literally just means mediated or to go between. Two groups or two people can't get along. Frequently, they seek a mediator who literally goes between conflicting groups. You may have heard the term medium referring to a psychic. That refers to someone who goes between people and the spirit world. In this case, the word media or medium just refers to what's between you and your audience as a communicator. The channel is an extension of a human. That's a human body part specifically. A phone is an extension of your ears, therefore it lets you hear things far away. A TV is an extension of your eye, which lets you see things that are far away. You can obviously argue that the phone and the TV are essentially the same thing at this point, but you get the idea. A channel is an extension of the person, whoever's receiving the message. What else makes mass communication different? It's one-way communication. So, go back to that model when we talked about different types of communication. Interpersonal communication is two-way communication. You send a message, you get a response from the other person almost immediately. That response may just be in the form of the face they're making, or that they're not paying attention to you at all. But there is a response. In group communication, you get a response from your receivers. The receivers may be nothing more than silent assent. It may be, if depending on what type of church you go to, it may be some people standing up and clapping and stomping their feet. But there is immediate response, what we call feedback. We'll get to that in just a second. Mass communication is one-way communication. You send a message out, you might not get a response from the audience at all. If you do, it is usually not immediate in the way it is with interpersonal or group communication. If you are a mass communicator, the difference in feedback takes some getting used to. So think about Jimmy Fallon. When he says something to someone on stage, he receives immediate feedback from that person. That is interpersonal communication. He receives nearly immediate feedback from his audience, which is group communication. Jimmy does not necessarily get feedback from you, the member of the TV audience. That is one-way communication. They, in fact, know very few things about the audience at the time of the communication. He does not know them. He certainly does not know them personally. Later on, he'll get to see ratings about the size of the audience and something about his demographic makeup. And if he did something particularly controversial or that got a rise out of the audience, he might get letters or emails or tweets after the show. Now, the internet has made it easier for faster feedback, but rarely does feedback occur in real time. At the time of the specific act of mass communication, it is one way. Specifically, we don't always know what keeps an audience involved or to what extent they're involved. If mass communicators knew what it took to deliver messages that people wanted, we wouldn't have to do all the research that we're going to talk about during this semester. This makes mass communication more difficult than other forms of communication for creating shared meaning. I can look at my wife or my son or my dog and immediately know whether he or she or it understands what I'm saying, and they can do the same for me. And I can adjust my message accordingly. In mass communication, I can't always tell. I don't know whether I'm boring you. I don't know whether people don't understand, and I don't know whether I should shut up until they drive out of the tunnel and can hear me again. Let's talk about a few more things related to communication. The first thing you need to know is that the word media is plural. This is going to come up over and over again, And I want you guys to hold me accountable in the same way that I'm going to hold you accountable for the way that we use this word. The word media is plural. It is a plural of the word medium. Therefore, when someone says the media is ignoring UAB, that is incorrect. Media is a plural. By the way, that sentence is both wrong and right. Some media outlets do ignore UAB. Weekly newspapers in Eastern Africa don't talk about UAB all that often. But you can't lump all media together. When you say media are biased, you are wrong. You can say MSNBC is biased. You can say Fox News is biased. And you can debate whether those things are true. You cannot say media are biased. That is ignorant. It's a nation with over 1,500 daily newspapers, 13,000 radio stations. There's weekly newspapers, TV stations, cable channels, magazines, Twitter accounts, social media, various types of internet. The media are not a monolith. If you are talking about mass media, you have to remember that mass media is a plural. Here are some recent examples of people who make media singular. Note, by the way, that many of the people doing this are media outlets themselves. Having said all that, especially the part about media being plural and not a unified them, it is still accurate to say mass media are giving us what we call a dominant culture. We're going to use the phrase agenda setting throughout the semester to discuss the key power of mass media, not necessarily to tell us what to think, but the power of influencing what it is we think about. Take everything that you know about the most recent presidential election. The most important candidates were the ones who got the most press. They can't tell you what you should think about the candidates. They tell you which candidates are important and important to pay attention to. If you pay attention to, for example, sports media, you know that it is important to pay attention to the college football playoff and the national championship game. You will see, you will not get nearly as much guidance in terms of paying attention to things like the FCS national championship game, or its playoff, which happened concurrently, but don't receive nearly as much press. Doesn't mean they necessarily tell you who to root for, but they tell you what's important, that you should pay attention to these things. Now, how this works in terms of a scientific model, just in case you need pictures, is key to helping us understand how media and society interact. So we'll start here. These are not models of mass communication. There are several different type models of mass communication. You see them all here. The one we're going to focus the most on is that one there at the top, which is called the transmission model, also known as SMCR. SMCR standing for source, message, channel, receiver. Basically, a source sends a message over a channel to a receiver. That's sort of like saying to play the flute, you move your fingers on one end and then blow on the other. It is obviously much more complicated than that. And since this model was not originally designed for mass communication, a bunch of other thinkers have added to it. So move on to a slightly more complicated model. Model starts with a source. In most cases, it's a human having a thought. That's intrapersonal communication, what we talked about earlier. A thought that stays in your head obviously is not mass communication until others hear it. And it doesn't do the world any good until it is encoded into a message. The message can be encoded using symbols, which are letters or images or sound that somehow have a meaning. That usually involves some type of a device, a camera, a keyboard, turntables, etc., to encode that thought into a message. How that message is encoded depends upon the source, which is you, the communicator, your knowledge of the topic, your culture, your attitude, and your skill. All these things play a role in the choices you make. Think about what stands between you and successfully transmitting a message to your mass audience. This model, in case you haven't noticed, is in Thai. If you don't speak Thai, you won't be able to communicate what's on this to a mass audience. How you craft your message depends on how much you know. how well you are able to turn your thought into a message that others will understand. Culture plays a role, obviously. In the South, we have words that aren't used as much in other parts of the nation, and vice versa. If you call something a buggy and I call it a shopping cart, do we at least understand that we're talking about the same thing? So, as you create your message, you have to make several decisions. The content. What exactly are you trying to say? The code, which is the symbols, the letters or images or sound that somehow have a meaning. Treatment, which is the arrangement or ordering of the content by the message. Are you going to tell this story as a just the facts message? Do you tell a story with characters and plot? In what order do you place the content? All of us have been involved in some type of a situation, maybe a class, maybe just having to listen to a story from your friends, where all you can think about is why won't this person get to the point? You've been thinking about this every time you write something for a class, or send a text, or make a film, or have to deliver good or bad news to someone. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and she thinks about this type of thing. She'll walk into a room to deliver a message. She's already thought about how she's going to deliver that message. Usually it's with some sort of opening line like, I have to tell you something important. And then it turns out it has something to do with her doll's hair. When you've made all those decisions and you've encoded your intrapersonal communication, that's when you've created a message. Even as you created that message, however, you have to be thinking about the communication channel you plan to use to transmit your message. The terms channel and transmit sound like broadcasting. Think about them in a wider context, if you will. The channel, in many instances, is the device that you use to send the message. Sometimes that can be broadcast, it could be print, it could be video or film. And the message, in part, is shaped by the channel. As we'll talk about later, the channel you choose will affect the message's content and meaning. That's because different communication channels are better for different senses your receiver might use or need to use to understand. Print is really good for delivering information. Sound and video are better for emotion. So you have to think about these things as you're crafting the message. You have to figure out how you're going to get that message out. More channels obviously means more clarity. When we talk about communication channels, we need to talk about how they're different and how to choose the right communication channel that will do what it needs you to do. There's a researcher named David Berlow who talked about something called fidelity. Fidelity is the idea that the more channels you have, the clearer your message will be. If you're looking, for example, at Seth Meyers in this GIF file, he's probably has a different meaning than the actual words that came out of his mouth. If I get a message from my wife saying that my dog has torn up something in the den, and I respond, "That's great," with a frowny face, maybe you know I'm being sarcastic. If you hear me on the phone saying, "That's great," and stretching it out and sounding whiny, you may know better that I'm being sarcastic. If you see me roll my eyes and scrunch my nose while I say it, then you've got a much more rich message. The richer the message, the better. The less noise in the message, and the more appropriate the feedback. Back to that SMCR model. If you're the source and you encode the message and you send it over the channel that you will think will provide the most fidelity, the next step for that message is to be decoded by the receiver. A newspaper story doesn't do any good until someone reads it. A TV show is not good until someone's seen it. A song is no good until someone hears it. Once the receiver has decoded the message, the receiver internalizes it into a thought. How the receiver does that depends on the receiver's knowledge of their culture and their attitude and their communication skill. That reception model may play a role here. We meant one thing, but the message is understood in a different way. If all goes well, the original thought of the sender becomes understood and shared by the receiver. Maybe that receiver will be motivated to action. Maybe they'll buy your product. Maybe they'll write a letter to the editor, or go to the meeting, or be persuaded and laugh at the right time. But as we've noted, the process is complicated. Sometimes the process doesn't work. Your message can be misunderstood or ignored. When a message is not understood, there is not shared meaning. This is caused by a thing called noise. Noise is anything that gets in the way of your message being understood by your audience. It may be real live static, environmental type of noise, like an AM radio station when you go through a tunnel. Or it could be a smudged page. It could be psychological noise. You could be offended by the message or daydreaming. If you're a football fan and I say that your team is bad, then you may have a psychological filter that would affect the message. You wouldn't pay attention to the actual message because I've angered you. It could be physical noise. You could be tired or you could be drunk. It could be semantic noise. Words get in the way. It could be that my polysyllabic acumen and adroitness leads to a dilatory effect on message clarity, leading us to become an anathema to our audience. Or you use big words that hurt meaning, and our audiences don't like us. Or it could be that your audience only speaks Thai and you don't. That's an informational filter. There's also cultural noise. Sometimes, as we mentioned earlier, you can say things that only you understand in your culture and others don't. You say Roll Tide, War Eagle, and it means anything, doesn't mean anything to the people who hear it. By the way, if you can think of another type of noise that maybe I've left out of this particular list, feel free to drop me a line. Because this transmission model wasn't designed specifically for mass communication, it's got some shortcomings. Can you think of something that's missing? Yeah, it's feedback. This goes back to what we said earlier. Communication is not a one-way street. Feedback is obviously key to interpersonal communication. That's what a conversation is. You say something, you get a response, you go from there. If the person you're speaking with doesn't understand what you're saying, you repeat yourself. If you talk a lot on a cell phone, you know how noise gets in the way. If you, for example, ever have a conversation with my father-in-law, you know there's no point in telling him anything if you're standing on a particular side of him because he's deaf in that ear. But we all have various ways in which shared meaning is effective. You have to have feedback to come up with negotiation that creates shared meaning. One other thing that I just want to go over real quickly, this SMCR model is outdated for two other reasons. Feedback can be quicker now, even for mass media. The audience is much more involved. We have moved to this converged model because so much media have come together and audiences are able to talk back to mass media and audiences are able to create their own mass media. The result in this model is the impact that media have on cultures and on people. We don't always know the impact that our messages are going to have because we don't always understand our audiences. Several years ago, the MTV had a reality show called 16 and Pregnant, which is telling the stories of girls who became pregnant in high school. The impact was interesting because there was a big increase in the number of children named Macy and Bentley after those two names were given to newborns on the show. But also, weirdly, there were fewer pregnant teens. One study said maybe 20,000 fewer teens became moms in 2010. It's a traditional way that media can affect us. You put on a show and people react in different ways. Scaring teens into not having children was not the purpose of this show. The purpose was just to tell stories and make money for MTV. But apparently it had a wide-ranging impact. Another example is the Ice Bucket Challenge. We don't always start with mass media setting the agenda. This was a social media viral challenge. It became all the rage several summers ago where people challenged others either to have cold water dumped on their heads or donate to charity, sometimes both. Brought in more than $100 million. Started online and went viral before it was picked up by mass media. This was not mass media setting the agenda. It was a local thing that landed in online media. It got noticed by other people and then got picked up by mass media. It became something we talked about. And this is, as you can see from Bill Gates' dumping water on his own head here, it had a lot of impact. So, that's all I want to talk about today for the model for mass media. On the discussion board, I want to start with a little bit of storytelling related to communication. Starts with the worst pickup line of all time. Do you know what my shirt is made of? Boyfriend material. I would submit to you that if you tried to use that line in the last week, your message was probably not as effective as you would have liked. So, on the discussion board, I want you to think about a time in the past week when your communication was not as effective as you would have liked. write a little bit about what had happened, when it happened, and the results of the exchange. So start here. What happened? Tell me about a time that you had communication that didn't land quite the way you wanted it to. Tell me what noise got in the way of your communication based on what we've talked about today. And finally, tell me what you do to improve the communication. What would you do over again if you had the chance? That's all for this week. Next week we'll pick back up and start talking about the various theories that help explain the way mass media have an impact on our society. If you have any questions, drop me a line at the email that I provided at the outset. Contact me through Canvas, through social media, or any other way that you can think of to contact me, and I will respond back to you within 24 hours. Have a good week.